All right, let's read our text here together of God's Word. Exodus 21, verse 33 to 36. Exodus 21, verse 33. When a man opens a pit, or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. When one man's ox butts another's, so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and share its price, and the dead beast also they shall share. Or, if it is known that the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has not kept it in, he shall repay ox for ox, and the dead beast shall be his. This is God's Word. Well, when the Hebrews were still slaves in Egypt, I remind you again that as we go through these case laws, it may seem like so much time is passing and we're in a totally different context, but this is still here at Mount Sinai, where God is now at this point speaking to Moses on the mountain as Israel has been fearful at the base of the mountain. And so they are still a very new group of people just out of slavery in Egypt, receiving these laws for the first time from God. And so when the Hebrews were still slaves in Egypt, just a short time before this, their lives had become dominated by Pharaoh, and by Pharaoh as the god of the system in Egypt, or the representative of the gods of Egypt. And when their lives were dominated by that tyrant of Egypt, their whole lives were, as we saw, just squeezed so that every last drop of what they had was given for Pharaoh, for Egypt and its purposes. As they were required, the requirements kept getting stricter and stricter. They had to make bricks without being given straw, the materials necessary. Their children were attacked. They were beat. The demands were impossible. And now, in their new lives as a free nation under Yahweh God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, their lives are also dominated by God, by the God of the system, which in this case is the true God. But in this case, under the one true God, their new lives are not dominated in the same way as they were under Pharaoh in Egypt. Their whole lives, their everyday lives, their everyday affairs, and how they relate to their neighbor, how they handle their property and their animals, all of these things were to be lived out in accordance with God's laws that He's given them. And God's laws here were to touch, indeed they did, every aspect of their lives. There was nowhere they could go where they were free from God. Freedom from Egypt does not mean freedom from direction and law under God. But the difference, of course, is that the laws we see laid out here by Yahweh God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, His laws, contrary to Pharaoh in Egypt, are laws of freedom. They are laws which free people to be the most free, to have the most liberty, to do what they're called to do under God. God had called them to take dominion. That's the dominion mandate, to take dominion of the earth, to be fruitful and multiply. And when God called them to this task of dominion taking, of course, we saw how the Egyptian gods and religious system kind of inverted that task. It said, everything for me, everything for the continued projects of Egypt, as you're going to serve our projects by slavery. But in this case, in God's call for His people to take dominion, He doesn't squeeze every last drop out of them. He doesn't give them impossible demands that they cannot meet. He gives them what they need for their task. He's given them, as they escaped Egypt, what did they have? They were given gold and clothing and all these gifts from Egypt, as God provided for them. Animals, land, property ownership now, families, children, all these things God is giving, and these are the things they need to be able to work toward that dominion mandate and fulfill and be obedient to it. All things they have are thus to be stewarded under God's laws to obey his mandates for them and the creation ordinances. With Pharaoh, it was just simply the gods of the system saying, give me that, give me more what you have. It's take from them. Basically, the mantra was, you will own nothing and be happy. But with Yahweh, he gives to them. He gives much to them. He gives them property and resources and things to be able to go out and take dominion and to have prosperity and success. And God then, in giving them, he doesn't just give them stuff or resources to do with what they want, but he gives them now these laws that instruct them how they're to use their property and their resources and their animals, and how they're to protect their neighbors and relate to their neighbors so that they can all work toward the fulfillment of the dominion mandate. See, the mandate which God has given man can only be successful when it's done in conformity to God's ethical standards. And so God is laying out for them how they relate to one another and to him in a society of people that's now a new free nation under God. As we saw in Egypt, Pharaoh's tyrannical, overreaching laws hindered their progress in this. And God's laws freed them now and protected them and their neighbors to obey it. So, as we consider that fact, in like manner, we are reminded that God is concerned with our everyday lives. He is concerned with the day in and the day out, the normal mundane tasks of how we relate to our animals and how we relate to our neighbors' boundaries and animals and property. Those are things that God is concerned about with his people. And he has given us principles and instruction on how we properly and righteously relate to one another in those ways so that it's for the good of society, the good of people being able to live together and grow together and obey God together. It's for the well-being of groups of people which we all live in. Many people today, the sentiment is that Christianity is fine so long as it's just your personal and private religion and it stays there. But the Christian religion is not a mere private spirituality that can simply be left at home when you go to work or when you go out to do things. It's a religion of dominion, of godly dominion, since Christ has dominion, authority, all power given to him. And he has something to say then about every area of life, both public and private, both personal and societal. He even has something to say about what you're supposed to do if you open up a pit and your neighbor's animal falls in. God tells us, what do we do? He tells us what to do in that situation. And that matters to God, what we do when our neighbor's animal is hurt because of our property being left open. That matters to God, how we act in that situation. So it should matter to us if we love God and want to obey him. God sees every little area of our lives. He sees what might seem to us like minor or insignificant interactions we have with our neighbors' property that seem like no big deal. God sees all those little interactions and how we treat others' property and animals and whatever the case may be. And all of that matters very much to God. And therefore, we also, as God's people, ought to be thoroughly concerned with always, in every moment, in every interaction with our neighbors, with people we live amongst. We ought to be concerned about living before God in every moment. In every little way we relate to our neighbor, we should be concerned with how does God tell me how to relate in this situation. Every little instance and interaction is a matter of integrity before God. It's not just the big, obvious, important things where integrity matters, but in the very small little interactions when maybe your neighbor's animal is hurt on your property and they don't know it, or it's an animal they've forgotten about or they've neglected. It doesn't matter. How are you supposed to act? What are you supposed to do? Every small thing that maybe can slip out of the eyes of man never slips out of the eyes of God, and is a matter of integrity before him. And so we should be concerned with every detail, every possible case. How do we act righteously and with integrity in these situations? So let's take a few minutes here and look at these cases before us in our text today, and then apply them to our situation in which we live. So the first case is there in verse 33 and 34. The first case, we have a man who opens or digs a pit. Now, in those days, the most common type of pit that they would have been digging or opening would have been a well or a cistern for water uses for their animal, their livestock, and themselves, of course. And, of course, in that much more agrarian type society with lots more moving around at this point in history, extremely valuable and important to have well access or cisterns. And so that's the first case here. We have a man who's opened a pit or a well. Of course, this would apply to any sort of pit in the ground that was dug for whatever reason. But if you have a man who uncovers or digs a pit or a well, then what should he do? He should make sure that it's covered up when it's not in use, when he's not there to guard it or use it. He should make sure it's covered up. Because if a man did not cover up his pit or his well, and then his neighbor's animal, his ox or his donkey, comes along and falls into it, now the owner of that pit is liable. He is held liable for the harm that comes upon the animal that has fallen into his well or pit. And so what we learn from this is that leaving a pit like this uncovered is considered negligent behavior. It's considered negligence, which gives you liability in the situation. So if this situation happened, what would be the cost he would have to pay? Well, the owner of the pit would have to make restoration. He would have to pay the owner of the animal whatever the market value price presumably was for the animal that fell into the pit and died. And then he would have to be responsible for removing the dead animal and doing with it whatever he had to do or wanted to do with it. So his neighbor, the situation is he's acted negligently with his property, and now because of his negligence, his neighbor has lost a real valuable asset in that ox or donkey or whatever animal it may be. And he's lost it because his neighbor has acted negligently. And so therefore, proper restoration, proper compensation is to be made. Now in the second case here, in verse 35, you have a slightly different scenario where, well, it's a very different scenario. You have two different animals of two different owners fighting one another. One animal attacks the other one, and they fight, and one of the animals dies. Well, in this case, specifically, you have the issue of when one man's ox butts another man. So specifically, the case is about oxen, which were domesticated animals for working farm and property type things. So these are not wild, untamed animals who are normally aggressive or normally fighting animals. So in this case, I think the broader application would be you have two domestic animals, some kind of cattle or farm type animals, fighting one another. One of them kills the other one. What happens in this case? Well, there's not the same level of liability involved because they're not known as fighting aggressive animals, and it's not necessarily anybody's fault in terms of which owner is at fault. Therefore, what happens in that case? Well, the live animal is to be sold, and the profits of it are split between the two owners of the two different animals. as well as the dead body is split between the two. So they could use the dead body. I don't know if they want to use it for the meat if the animal was killed by another animal, but the hide or other animal products you could make from it would be have some value for them. So there's another case here in verse 36, the third case. The third case is a variation of the one we just looked at. In the third case, we have an animal that's been accustomed to gore in the past, or he's been known to be aggressive, and he's been known to fight. And so this animal with a bad track record kills another man's animal. And this is very similar to the case we looked at, I think, last week when an ox who's known to gores a man. There's incredible liability. In fact, the owner could be put to death. In this case, it's just an animal. It's not another person. And so, therefore, there is liability because he's been known to be aggressive and fight. And yet, it is an animal, which is less valuable than a person. Therefore, the man's not to be put to death, but he is to repay ox for ox. So he's to restore the same type of animal that his animal killed. It wouldn't be that he would give the man that notorious ox. It would be that he would restore something of like value, because the notorious ox probably should be put to death at this point, or certainly his value is not the same. There's much more high risk value than whatever animal was killed. And so it wouldn't be a legitimate, fair compensation. So he has to restore his neighbor's ox or animal that was killed and take care of the dead one. So those are our three cases today. And as we read them, they're pretty straightforward, very simple to understand. So let us consider then the principles that inform how these cases are to be handled. There are principles here that inform how the cases are handled. And those are the things that can really have broader application in our lives today. I would say the underlying principle in these cases is that God's blessing of property ownership, that with God's blessing of property ownership comes responsibility for your property. So with property ownership comes responsibility. So freedom from slavery, freedom from tyranny is not freedom from responsibility, but rather it's the embracing of more responsibility. The more free you are, and the more with your freedom you own more things, the more responsibility you have in your life. And the more things you have to be sure you handle correctly and take responsibility for. And with that responsibility of ownership also comes more costs. There are more costs that are righteously involved in property ownership of many different kinds of property. If you have, in the case before us, an asset like a well on a piece of land, that would be a very valuable asset. If you have that, if you own that, there are costs that come with owning that. If you have this pit or this well, you would be required, or you should make the investment of securing proper covering for it. And so the idea is that we're not allowed to cut corners or cut costs at the stake of responsibility and liability. So the cost of properly maintaining the hazards on your property it costs things to properly secure a well, but that cost is much less than the cost that would come should an animal or person even fall into your pit or well because of your negligence, because you're trying to cut costs and corners. That's going to end up being more costly in the long run should something happen than if you would have just taken the extra time and cost to be responsible with your property. You can also see, especially then in a case as specific as in our text, if an ox or a donkey or an animal fell into your well and died, not only would you have the costs of restoring that animal and removing the dead beast and so forth, but it's very likely that would contaminate your well and ruin it, which would be even more devastating of a cost than if you simply would have taken the time to properly insure it and cover it in the first place. So, true ownership does not come without the weight of responsibility. And if there is a great responsibility that comes with owning things, then that responsibility that comes with property ownership shows us then the legitimacy and the need for boundaries, fences, barriers, things like that. Such is what a well covering would have been, a type of boundary or barrier, especially in that day in which there would not have been, we live in a day where it's a very fenced society in terms of our property. With ancient Israel here, it would have been much different. They would have been, in this time of their life, traveling more, so there would not have been the same type of fencing. Therefore, the important need for covering that well directly. So, anyway, the point is there's a legitimacy to boundaries, barriers, fences, things like that for what you own to properly protect your neighbor. Now, there's another principle here that's extremely important for us to consider that maybe we need to consider in our own lives, and that is that property rights are not absolute rights. Property rights are not ultimate rights. What I mean is that, for example, most of us in our society, in our culture, our subculture in which we live, we have a very high view of property rights. And that's good. The Bible